Thank you. It's so nice to have our future leaders with us today. And now I'd like to briefly recognize the head table. And again, if you'd please hold your applause until I finish. From my left, your right, Vice President Michelle McGovern, President-elect Ed Chase, and Education Secretary Arne Duncan. On the other side of the lectern, Secretary-Treasurer Tony Perozzi, past Presidents David Baker and Manny Farage, and the Reverend Lucky Arnold. All of you can remember what it was like when you were in school and it was time for report cards to come out after each grading period. There was always a little anxiety to see how you did. Did you study enough? Did you do better than last time? Did you do better than that obnoxious guy who sat next to you? What were your parents going to think? Today we are the parents, and we're going to ask U.S. Education Secretary Arne Duncan to give us a report card on how American public schools are faring. What progress have we made, and what can we expect in the future for our children and grandchildren? For the record, I see no traces of anxiety as he prepares to give us the news. Arne Duncan was named U.S. Secretary of Education by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the U.S. Senate on January 20th, 2009. Prior to his appointment, Duncan served as the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools from 2001 to 2008, becoming the longest-serving big city education superintendent in the country. Before joining the Chicago Public Schools, he ran the Aerial Education Initiative, a nonprofit focused on advancing educational opportunities in economically disadvantaged areas. From 1987 to 1991, Secretary Duncan played professional basketball in Australia, where he also worked with children who were wards of the state. That was after he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1987. May I present Secretary Duncan.
Thank you so much, Gail. I'm thrilled to be here. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief and look forward to a great question and answer session afterwards. And one of the joys of my job is I get to travel across the nation. I've been to all 50 states, and I've been to hundreds and hundreds of schools. And when I go, I look at the data, I look at the trends, I try and do my homework as best I can. But at the end of the day, when I visit school, it's just sort of a simple test. My wife and I have 2 young children, and is the school good enough for my own children? And if the school is good enough for my own children, then I feel really, really good about it. If it's not, then we have some challenges. I think too often in our nation, historically, in some places, we've created schools that were somehow good enough for someone else's children, but not good enough for our own. And we have to get way past those days. And I do visit some schools that are frankly heartbreaking, where children deserve so much better than what they're getting. But the majority of the visits I go, the schools I visit, what I see is actually really inspiring. I see schools focus on helping students find their passion, helping to foster their creativity. And just to give you a couple quick anecdotes, visit a school called Trans Mountain High School in El Paso, Texas. It's an all-immigrant population, all first generation, 9th grade, and the 9th graders are taking biology for college credit. So these are young people who don't have a family member who's gone to college, and as 14 and 15-year-olds, they're going to have a college credit in their back pocket. Visited an amazing school called P-Tech in New York, inner city community, again, very challenged population, but IBM is partnered with them. And the young people there are not just going to graduate from high school, they have the opportunity to earn an associate's degree at the same time. Every single student is paired with an IBM mentor, and they all have preference for jobs down the road. And while it's still early, they're going to have the first graduating class coming up. The results they're getting, despite poverty, despite all the challenges in that community, are simply extraordinary. And then just 2 weeks ago, I visited a fantastic little elementary school in Virginia that has 9 classes of early childhood education. They have an award-winning kindergarten teacher who's been there 16 years. Because of this influx of our early learning opportunities, she said for the first time ever this year, all of her children started kindergarten ready to be successful. She wasn't having to play catch-up, and what a transformative experience that was for her. And just, again, more broadly as I travel, more and more schools are focused on the skills that are so essential today: critical thinking and problem solving, the ability to work as a team, to communicate clearly and thoughtfully, to process information and make decisions, and ultimately to help our children love to learn so they become lifelong learners. And if we do that, they're going to be successful in whatever they choose to do. That's what employers are looking for. And the trends that I see nationally are reflected in those kinds of anecdotes. So big picture, you sort of asked about the nation's report card, where we're at. Lots that we should be really proud of. We announced very recently that high school graduation rates for the nation are at all-time highs, 81%. That's huge. Dropout rates are down pretty significantly. African-American dropout rates over the past decade are down 45%. Latino dropout rates have been cut in half from 28 to 14%. With higher graduation rates, reductions in dropout rates, over the past 4 or 5 years, that's led to 1.1 million additional students of color, not just graduating from high school, but going on to college. So huge progress there. Florida's done a really good job of helping lead the nation in so many of these ways. Over the past decade, Florida's graduation rate has gone up, I think, 17, 18 points. Florida is one of the states that's done the best job, both of raising the bar on NAEP scores and also closing those insidious achievement gaps so that every child has a chance to be successful. So there's much that is right here. But having said, both where we are as a nation and where we are here in Florida, we know we have so far to go. And I think that's what brings so many of us to work every single day. In terms of early childhood education, I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's so important. Relative to other nations, industrialized nations, in terms of providing access, we rank 28th. It's a dismal record. 27 other countries do a much better job than this. On the K-12 side, on most of the international benchmarks, reading and math, we're usually somewhere between 15th and 30th. About a third of black students in the United States in their high schools don't have access to calculus, don't have access to the STEM classes they need to be successful. Remediation rates here in Florida and around the nation are still far too high. So these are not just our high school dropouts, these are our high school graduates who are going on to higher education, and nationally, a minimum in most states, and it's probably true here in Florida, a minimum of a third of our high school graduates are having to take remedial classes when they go to college, meaning they're burning through Pell Grants, taking non-credit bearing classes. It's not fair to taxpayers, not fair to them. They have higher dropout rates, longer time to degree. And then in terms of college graduation rates, one generation ago we led the world, and today we're 12th. Not something we should be proud of. So yes, we should celebrate the progress. Yes, we should build upon the momentum. But if we're going to be very, very honest with ourselves at every level, early childhood education, long way to go. K-12, long, long way to go. Higher education, which should be the norm for everyone, 12th, when our goal has to be first. So because of that reality, we're seeing huge and difficult and ambitious changes happening in schools here in this community, in Florida, and around the nation. And change is always very, very hard. It's difficult, nothing easy about change, nothing easy about raising the bar, but hugely, hugely important, and it's starting to pay off. States are raising standards so that we're no longer lying to children saying they're ready when they're not, and trying to make sure that when they graduate, they are truly college and career ready and don't have to take remedial classes. I think that's the least that we can offer to our children. We're trying to do a much better job around the nation of supporting teachers and principals in the hard work that they do every single day. Nothing is more important, nothing, than having a great teacher in every classroom and a great principal in every school. And if we do that, our children, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their difficulties or challenges, are going to do extraordinarily well. We're working hard to have better assessments. I know Florida's had some challenges, and happy to talk about that in a moment. But having better assessments that can go beyond fill out the bubble tests and measure critical thinking, measure problem-solving skills, and give a much more honest assessment of where students are, so children, their parents, and their teachers can work together to build upon strengths and to work on weaknesses. And then for me, the end goal is very simple. As we raise graduation rates and reduce dropout rates, we have to make sure that our children are truly college and career ready once they graduate from high school. That's the goal. And who's leading these huge, massive, unprecedented changes? It's really not me or anyone else in Washington. It's great teachers and great principals. And I try and listen as I travel the country and hear what they're saying and what's working and what's not, the successes and the frustrations and the challenges. I'll just give you a couple quick quotes from teachers. One is an amazing early childhood educator in a very poor rural community in Arkansas named Justin Minkle, an award-winning teacher. He says, one of our big picture visions for our students is that they go on to live the lives they dream. We have these very specific and quantifiable goals, but they're tied to something much bigger and much more meaningful. Then I visited an amazing school in Boston, which is one of the lowest performing schools, Orchard Gardens, not just in Boston, but in the state of Massachusetts. And it's gone from a dismal record The school that was a school of last resort to a school of choice. The extraordinary things are happening for children. And one of the teachers there, Andrew Vega, talked about how hard these challenges were of raising standards and trying to do more and raising expectations, particularly in a very, very challenged community. But he wrote recently, he said he is now a better and a happier teacher than I've ever been. And then an amazing teacher here in Florida, Misty Neal Gooseby in Lehigh High School. This is what she said recently. The hunger to be the best teacher and to present the best lesson is so right for education right now. It's about the ability to stay in the profession that we love. And I think we have to keep listening to teachers, keep listening to principals, keep coming back, what's working, what's not, how do we make mid-course adjustments, and really empower them to lead this transformation that we're seeing around the nation. My vision and my goal is actually really, really simple. We want our schools to hold all students to high standards. And we want to give every single child, every student, access to the tools they need to succeed in college, in career, in life. Again, I think that's the least that we can do as educators. To get there, we see two major opportunities ahead of us to go to the next level. First of all, for the past 100 years, we've had a system of education that served the nation pretty well that was K through 12. We think for the next 100 years, or maybe for the next couple years, that's no longer sufficient. We have to start much earlier than kindergarten. We know how much learning goes on 0 to 5. Any of us as parents know that intuitively. And a high school diploma, while important, is no longer enough. We have to think about community college, or at least 2 years of college beyond that. So while K to 12 has been pretty good for a long time, we have to start thinking about a pre-K through 14 system, giving every child and every family who wants those opportunities before kindergarten and wants those opportunities after high school to take those next steps. Those ideas don't come from me or from the president. They're not democratic ideas. The state that's probably done the best job on the early childhood side, the state that's deeply red, is Oklahoma. They've done a fantastic job of basically providing universal access. The idea of making community colleges free that the president talks so much about in the State of the Union didn't come from him or from me. That's been Tennessee's leadership and Governor Haslam. They've done an extraordinary job. And just in the first year, they anticipated something like 25,000 applicants. They've had like 75,000 applicants. And think how many first-generation college goers are going to take the next step beyond high school and didn't think that was possible before. So that's one opportunity, is just thinking very differently about the education trajectory of our students. And then secondly, we have a real chance to work with Congress in a bipartisan way to fix the broken and the outdated No Child Left Behind law. And I could go on for an hour about all the challenges there and all the difficulties. I lived on the other side of the law when I led the Chicago Public Schools, so I know them very, very well. But let me just say where I think we should go, and again, have to put politics and ideology to the side and just do the right thing for children. And every day we sort of think about what's the appropriate federal role, because so much of education is, and always has been and always will be, a local issue at the state and at the local communities. But what can we do well at the federal level? Three things I think are hugely important. First, we have to fight for equity. We have to fight for the children who historically have been underserved. So for me, it means expanding access to high-quality early childhood education. That means putting more money behind Title I to support poor families. It's making sure English language learners have a chance to be successful. This law goes back to 1965. It's ultimately a civil rights law, and staying very true to that history, I think, is so important. Secondly, I think the law must focus on excellence. We have to make sure that every child has access to high standards. We have to, as a nation, do a much better job of supporting teachers and principals in doing the hard and difficult and complex but extraordinarily important work they do every single day. And we think there's a chance to go to the next level in this law. And then finally, we think a really appropriate federal role is fostering and supporting innovation. And there's so much great work we see, whether it's in Florida or whether it's in rural Tennessee or in Appalachia or inner city New York, where children from very difficult situations are graduating at much higher rates, are taking college classes much earlier than ever before, and we should be sharing those best practices and investing in them and taking them to scale. So those three things, equity and excellence and innovation, we think are at the heart of what this law can and should be. This should not be about politics, should not be about ideology. This should be a great bipartisan effort to do the right thing by children. We also worry that while there's a real opportunity, there's also risk that folks will go backwards here. And we do not want to take a step backwards. We don't think our kids or our families or our nation can afford to do that. We don't want to go back to a time when many states dummied down their standards, had low standards to make politicians look good, In fact, we were lying to children and families and telling them they were ready, and they weren't. Historically, we haven't done a great job of recognizing the extraordinary work that teachers do, and recognizing excellence and learning from that and rewarding them, sharing those best practices. We have to keep moving forward and doing a better job there. Historically, in far too many communities, we had high schools that were literally dropout factories, where every single year 40, 50, 60% of students dropped out. We've challenged that status quo very, very hard. That's part of the reason you see high school graduation rates climbing and dropout rates going down. And again, at the end of the day, in every state in the nation, remediation rates are way too high, and we have to make sure we have a high bar for every single student. The progress we're seeing, none of it is easy, not as fast as we would like, but it is real, it is measurable, and we need to stay the course. We know what works for children. It's access to high-quality early learning opportunities, particularly in disadvantaged communities where young people don't have all the advantages that many of us were lucky to have when we were growing up in our homes. We have to have high expectations for every single student, and we have to make sure that high school graduation, while again is an important marker, cannot be the end of the education journey. In some form of higher education, four-year universities, two-year community colleges, trade, technical, vocational training, that has to be the goal for every single one of our high school graduates. And ultimately, I'm just absolutely convinced that if we want to have strong families, if we want to have strong communities, if we want to increase social mobility and reduce inequalities, if we want to keep high-wage, high-skilled jobs in our communities, in our states, and ultimately in our nation, that the only way we're going to get there is to give every single child in this nation access to a world-class education that they so desperately need and deserve. My just challenge to you, my challenge to all of our friends in Washington to get past their dysfunction and work together is to work with a real sense of courage, with humility, to learn from our mistakes, but ultimately with a sense of urgency to get this work done on behalf of our nation's children. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
If any of you have questions, if you want to hold them in the air, our volunteers will come by and collect them one more time. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to start right off with this one. With Common Core standards off to a rough start as far as acceptance and implementation, how do you get parents and teachers to accept it, and should it be tweaked in any way?
These questions are lots of pieces tied in this. Let me try and break them down one at a time. The idea of having high standards, I think, is desperately important. And historically, when, as I said, we had about 20 states that dummied down standards to make politicians look good, is for me untenable. Now, states can work together, states can work independently on this, and for me it should just be one measuring stick. If a state's institutions of higher education, the higher education community says that children who hit these standards don't have to take remedial classes, we should all be happy. Now, raising the bar is not easy. Tennessee is our fastest improving state. Tennessee historically has some of the lowest standards. And my numbers won't be exact, but a few years ago, Tennessee was saying something like 91% of their kids were proficient in math in 4th grade. When they raised standards, they went from about 91% to like 30-something%. Children weren't performing less well. It was just a much more honest assessment. And from that baseline, Tennessee has become the fastest improving state in the nation because they had a real level playing field. And so it is hard, it is challenging, but we have to stay the course. And anyone who thinks the answer to what ails us educationally is to somehow lower standards doesn't make sense.
I apologize. I skipped right over our students. Would the students please stand up and say their name and ask their questions? I'm sorry.
Okay, hello, my name is Marilyn. Ooh. And I come from St. Lucius, and I'm from Advanced Placement of Government and Politics. And my question is, the America's College Promise to provide 2 years of free community college for responsible students. What plans for implementation do you have, and what time frame do you anticipate? Can this year's graduating seniors expect to have this available for them?
First of all, I just want to congratulate you and your fellow students on the AP classes. I think it's so important that young people today graduate not just with a high school diploma, but some kind of college credit as well. So whether it's AP or dual enrollment or early college or industry certification, you guys are doing everything the right way. And please give the students and their teacher and principal a huge round of applause. So I wish we were implementing this for our seniors, but I always try and tell the truth. And for the President's vision to be enacted, we need Congress to approve this, and we need Congress to fund this. And to be very clear, this would not be some mandate coming from Washington. We would simply partner with states who are investing themselves to make sure, again, not just K to 12 was an opportunity, but in my world, in a perfect world, pre-K through 14 would be an opportunity. So we need folks in Congress to support this and to invest in this. And there's often debate about education. I always say education is not an expense, it's an investment. It's the best investment we can make. And if you or your friends leave high school and try and go get a good paying job now, the high school diploma, that's pretty hard. But if you have at least an associate's degree or ideally a bachelor's degree, you have a whole different world of opportunity ahead of you. So we're hoping Congress, again, will work together, but the time frame in terms of next school year will be difficult to reach.
Are you guys able to hear us in the back? Okay.
Okay, yeah.
You're too tall.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have another question from the students? Yes.
Hello, hi, my name is Frisner Severe from St. Lucia's High School, and my question is, in your speech on January 12th, you started the admission believing NCLP must be rewritten. Why does this admission suggest the biggest change should be to the law, and why?
So I'll try and be short and not give you an hour-long answer, but there was a lot that was broken around No Child Left Behind. First of all, there's way too much focus in my mind on a single test score. Test scores tell you a little bit, they don't begin to tell you everything. It was a focus just on proficiency, which is a small number of students right around that. It didn't look at growth and gain. I want to see how much students are improving each year. So whether you're gifted or average or special needs, I want to see that improvement. None of that was spotlighted in No Child Left Behind. But ultimately, I think the law just got wrong what Washington's role was. The law was very loose in terms of standards. So many states dummied down standards I've talked about, but very tight, very prescriptive on how to improve. I think that's fundamentally backwards. We want to flip that on its head. We think we should have a high bar, that we should challenge states to have college and career-ready standards for every single child. Again, whether they do that together or individually doesn't matter, but we should be very loose, give a lot more flexibility for folks to figure out how to hit that high bar. And what I've seen, in rural Kentucky versus inner city Baltimore versus in Alaska, on Native American reservations, I think it'd be the height of arrogance for me or anyone else in Washington to think we could prescribe how people hit that high bar. So being tight on goals but loose on means, the law fundamentally got wrong. The final thing under law was like 20 ways to fail and no rewards for success and for excellence. And I'm much more interested in spotlighting best practices and amazing schools and districts that are beating the odds. Yes, we need to challenge the status quo where it's not working. We have to do a lot more to learn from what is working in so many places around the country, then again, and spread and share those best practices.
Is it now time to allow states to include test scores in teacher evaluations?
These are all, again, really hard, complicated questions. I think student learning has to be a part of teacher evaluations. And the goal of every great teacher is not to teach, is to have their children learn. And one thing that I learned when I came to Washington, which stunned me, is we had a handful of states where it was literally against the law. It was against the law to tie student learning to teacher evaluation. And that, again, I think creates some very weird dynamics. So I do think student learning has to be part of teacher evaluation. You always have to look at multiple measures. And I say that everywhere I go. Anyone who thinks 100% should be on a test score, I think is ridiculous. But anyone who thinks that student learning shouldn't be in there, I think also doesn't make sense. And looking at a set of things, student growth and gain, looking at leadership, looking at professional development, looking at what they're doing to help build the school climate, I think all those things are important. And again, for me, it's never about gotcha. It's about how do we support teachers and help them get better? How do we recognize great talent and share that talent and learn from it? And then ultimately, if teachers aren't working, we need to make that honest call, because our kids can't afford to have 1 or 2 or 3 teachers where it's simply not working, where it's not effective. They fall too far behind. How we better recognize excellence, how we better support teachers who are trying to get better every single day, and how we have more challenging conversations where it's simply not working. We need to get better along that entire continuum.
Okay, here's a tough one. If you were given a chance to redo or improve on a particular policy or initiative begun during your time as Secretary of Education, what would that be and what would you do differently?
I always say, tax dollars are scarce and sacred, and all of us here are taxpayers, and we're not going to give out money for things that aren't working. If I had one tax dollar to spend, I would put it into early childhood education. I think it's the best investment we can make. And if I could do nothing else, I'd make sure that every child who wants access has access. As I travel the nation, virtually every state I go to has waiting lists. Some states, thousands of kids, 3- and 4-year-olds, whose parents want something better for them, and they simply can't afford it. They don't have the dollars, and we as a nation deny them that opportunity. We do that. Far too many children who come from disadvantaged communities start kindergarten at 5 years old, a year to 16 months behind. And as a nation, we don't do a great job of catching them up. It's not fair to our kids, it's not fair to their teachers, their classmates, or to their families. So while I'm proud that we've invested north of $1 billion to increase access and to make sure it's high quality, again, we have a devastating level of unmet need around the country, and that's my greatest frustration. Not to go on too long on this, but what I love is this has become a total bipartisan issue in the real world. And Republican and Democratic governors are all investing. Governor Abbott of Texas just came in and said his first priority is to increase access to a high-quality early learning. It's fantastic. We simply can't get our friends in Washington, and frankly our Republican friends in Washington, to look at what's going on back home and to partner with states that are trying to do the right thing here. So that's my biggest frustration.
Do you think charter schools have helped or hindered our educational system?
Probably both. And I'm a fan of high-performing charter schools. I'm not a fan of low-performing charter schools. I'm a fan of traditional schools that are doing a great job. I'm not a fan of traditional schools that aren't doing a great job. And where we're seeing success, whether it's in charter schools or traditional schools or magnet schools, whatever they might be, again, we need to learn it and share those best practices and replicate. We invest a couple $100 million each year to replicate high-performing charter schools. And some of the most amazing schools I've seen in disadvantaged communities happen to be charter schools. We've also gone to the National Charter School Conference and challenged them where you have low-performing schools, we need to do something very different or close them down. And there's nothing inherently good or bad about the name charter or traditional. We just need more schools where we don't have academic failure. We need more schools that have high expectations, where students are graduating. And we need to build upon, again, replicate what's working, and where it's not, challenge the status quo with a real sense of urgency.
In international rankings, the United States is ranked anywhere from 14th to 26th in student competence overall, and even lower in math. Should we worry about this?
Yes. I worry about it every single day, and hopefully I addressed that when I spoke. And again, just to repeat what I said before, at every level, we cannot be satisfied. So on the early childhood side, to be 28th is not a badge of honor. On the K-12 side, again, 15th to 30th, not where we want to be. College graduation rates, 12 today, one generation ago first. So we need to get better. We need to get better faster. And you guys all here know that children today aren't competing for jobs here locally. They're competing for jobs with children in China, in India, South Korea, Japan, Singapore. And our children are as smart, as talented, as creative, as entrepreneurial, hardworking as children anywhere in the world. But we as adults have to level the playing field for them. We have to invest in them. We have to invest in education. And if we don't do that, we put our children and ultimately our nation at a competitive disadvantage. And I don't know who that serves well.
Let me see. Are the standards for teachers training at colleges and universities adequate to guarantee high-quality teachers?
Often they're not. And schools of education, while there are some fantastic ones, in many places are nowhere near strong enough. And I know that anecdotally, we know that through the data, but when I go talk to fantastic young teachers and ask them do they feel prepared to enter the classroom, far too many say they were not. And two big complaints I hear from great young teachers. First, is just not enough hands-on actual teaching kids. Lots of theory of education and history of education and philosophy of education, not how do I take these 25 or 30 or 35 very diverse learners and help each one of those children be successful. The second one is there's been this flourishing of technology that can be a great teaching tool and really figuring out in real time our children learning, and far too often folks who are in the schools of education weren't around, frankly, when this stuff was happening, so teachers are having to learn this on the job. And we have to do so much to improve the quality of teacher prep, the many teacher prep programs. We have to think about not just that, but how we can better support master and mentor teachers So I look along the entire career trajectory of a teacher, starting from a prospective teacher, 17, 18-year-old is a freshman in high school, to that 55, 60-year-old teacher who has so much knowledge to share. We have so much we need to do to elevate and strengthen the teaching profession, and some bright spots, but we have a long, long way to go as a nation there.
Student debt has surpassed $1.2 trillion. Is this debt a bubble and a danger to the economy? And what can be done to bring down the cost of college education?
So having a debt north of $1 trillion is not a great thing. And young people who want to buy a home or buy a car or start a business, having that kind of debt is a real challenge. Having said that, going to college is the best investment that any young person can make in their long-term life, their livelihood, their financial well-being, in their children and their grandchildren for generations to come. So we never want to do anything to discourage going on to higher education. Again, that has to be the goal for every single high school graduate. But yes, we need to work together to reduce college debt. One way we could do that would be to make community colleges free. And that's, again, this America's College Promise I talked about earlier. And if you took out, 30, 40, 50% of the cost of a four-year degree, that would be a huge step in the right direction. Different things we also have to do. We at the federal level have to continue to invest in Pell Grants and other things, and we've put an additional $40 billion behind Pell Grants, gone from 6 million recipients to 9 million without going back to taxpayers for a nickel. We simply cut out the middleman, started making loans ourselves. We feel fantastic about that. States have to continue to invest in higher education. States can't abdicate that responsibility. And it's interesting to me in tough economic times how education generally gets cut, but incarcerating young people normally doesn't get cut in state budgets. And I always sort of say budgets reflect our values, our priorities, and why education gets cut, but we continue to lock people up at $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 and have no qualms about that. That value structure I don't quite get. And finally, we have to challenge higher education itself to continue to reduce costs and do some things differently with technology. So we have a role to play, states have a role to play, universities have a role to play. And then ultimately, we want to do a much better job of getting better information to parents and students. Navigating this is extraordinarily difficult for those of you that have been through it. And just what's a grant? What's a loan? What's not the one-year cost? What's the four-year cost? What are the graduation rates? And the more transparent we can be, the more families and students are making the right choices for them, good actors will get rewarded and bad actors will be challenged.
As a former big city superintendent of schools, what suggestions do you have for our Florida big districts seeking new superintendents?
Well, I'm a big fan of the superintendent in Miami, and Miami's been an award-winning district and won the Broad Prize. Bob Runcie, who's a new superintendent in Broward County, actually worked for me in Chicago, so I'm biased. I think he's fantastic. Candidly, I think Mary Ellen Elia in Hillsborough County was great. Somehow she lost her job. Don't quite understand that. Seemed like things are going well there. So a couple things. I just think stability is so important, and whether many of you are in business. The average tenure, I think, for a big city school superintendent is like 2.5 years. None of you would run your businesses that way. When I left Chicago to move to Washington, I had been in Chicago for 7.5 years as a superintendent. I think I was the longest serving big city superintendent in the nation at that point. That makes no sense. So be very thoughtful in who you hire, but you have to support that leadership. And stability and continuity is so important. And somehow, whether it's at the superintendent level or the principal level, there's this idea that this constant churn is good. And I think, candidly, the political dysfunction there really does not serve children well. So, lots of great candidates out there, but for me, that's almost the easy part of how do you support and nurture that talent, and how do we have more superintendents who spend 10, 15, 20 years in a district and have that great run that you see so many CEOs of very successful companies have. And somehow the tenures seem to be getting shorter and shorter rather than longer and longer. So for me, let's think about the hiring part. That's almost, frankly, the easy part of the equation. How we better support and nurture, and every superintendent has lots of flaws and weaknesses. I know I had more than my share, but how do we help them develop? How do we surround them with a team that complements their strengths and helps them where they have weaknesses? And I think that is just so much more important than, well, this guy has this one little flaw, let's fire him after 2 years and bring on the next person. I just don't understand that mentality.
Okay, would any of the following help raise the accomplishments of students? Longer school days, longer school years, smaller classrooms?
Yes, yes, and yes. So when I see high-performing schools, particularly we talked about some of the charter schools, they're doing some innovative things, but frankly, they're just working a little bit harder. Their kids are going to school 9 hours a day. They're there on Saturdays. They're there 11 months of the year. And when children are behind, you have to work a little harder to catch up. And most of you who have been successful in this room, I would bet, have pretty good work ethics and had an opportunity to hone your skills. So anyone that thinks that 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months of the year is sufficient for children who don't have all the advantages, who don't have 2 parents at home and summer camps and ballet lessons and piano lessons, totally misses the boat. So we absolutely have to look at longer days and longer years. Normally I say that adults cheer, and normally kids want to throw things at me. But I think we could be very thoughtful and differentiate. And if children had a passion for debate or robotics, how do you use the summer months differently? How do you help them if they want to, love to play the clarinet or play the drums or be in a play? And so it's not just about constant classroom time, but how do you find their passions? How do you find what they love to do and really help support them there? Obviously, if you ask any teacher or parent or child, if you want to be in a class of 30 or in a class of 15, I don't think anyone raised their hand and say 30. And so the smaller class size is important. What's most important is having a great teacher in that classroom. And the really hard question to ask parents, which is an interesting one, is would you rather have your child in a class of 15 with a mediocre teacher or a class of 25 with an extraordinary teacher? And that's an interesting sort of thought experiment for us as parents to figure out which one you'd prefer.
We have several questions on testing. While keeping high standards is important, how do we move from a culture focused on tests and their results to innovative learning and thinking?
So I think so much of what we tried to do through the waiver process in response to Congress not fixing No Child Left Behind for the past 6 years is to really challenge states to be creative here. And so first of all, this idea of accountability being a test just doesn't make sense. So we have a lot of states now looking, yes, a little bit at the test. That's a piece of what they're doing, but they're much more focused on graduation rates. They're much more focused on closing achievement gaps. They're much more focused on reducing dropout rates. They're focused on their high school graduates going on to college. They're looking at college-going rates not needing remedial classes. They're looking at college perseverance. And some people say this is more complicated and difficult, but I would say if you have great third-grade test scores and a 50% dropout rate, it's hard to go get a great job with a third-grade test score. So looking at a whole set of other indicators that are more long-term and more relevant to the world in which our children are going, I think is hugely important. As I said earlier, we want to do so much to support innovation, to support creativity, to support problem solving. That's what great teaching is about. It's about helping children find their joy, find their passion, and pulling that out of them. And so these things are not in conflict. I think there are many places that do over-test, and where we have too much testing, where there's too much time teaching to the test, when the tests are duplicative or redundant, when you're doing too much test prep, well then stop doing it. It's not that hard. Just stop doing it. Have an honest assessment. When I ran the Chicago public schools, our kids were taking the state test, Illinois state test, which made sense. Our kids were also taking the Iowa test of basic skills. I wasn't sure why my kids in Chicago needed to take the Iowa test, so we stopped taking it, cut out about 50% of the testing. And so I think just having very honest conversations where it's too much. Again, we would like, in fixing No Child Left Behind, to actually set a cap, challenge states to set a cap on it. But there are also others who want to walk away from any assessments, and I'm never going to support that. I think assessing kids annually, seeing how much they're growing, how much they're improving this each year, is hugely important to children, to parents, to teachers themselves. And we need to sort of come together, again, forget the politics and ideology, and find that common sense middle ground.
Despite all the research that indicates arts education produces more disciplined students with essential critical thinking skills, arts education funding is negligible. How would you address this shortcoming?
Yeah, so I think you have to look at your wealthiest districts or your most successful private schools, and arts aren't extra there. They're not extracurricular, they're part of the curriculum. And so that may be true what you say about arts, but also arts can help keep kids in school who might not come to school otherwise. If you want to improve math results, try a little music. And so I think there's so much in what I call a well-rounded world-class education that has to be fundamental to what we're doing. So arts is hugely important. Physical education is hugely important. Foreign languages are hugely important. Our children who are growing up monolingual are at a disadvantage. Children in Europe, other places, they're all growing up bi and trilingual. Financial literacy is increasingly important. So all of these things, it can't be this versus that, can't be either or, it's got to be both and. And again, do we want our children growing up not having access to the arts or not having access to foreign languages or to PE? Or do we think this is just sort of core to giving children a well-rounded, world-class education? And we as adults have to decide what's important. So yes, arts is huge, but so are these other things, and it can't be pitting one against the other. It doesn't make sense.
What can or what does the federal government do to help principals recruit and retain teachers?
So we've worked really hard, and again, we're obviously a couple steps removed from the action, but we have a major initiative called Teach to Lead. And what we're really trying to do is to help build or help highlight best practices where teachers are finding ways to impact the profession itself, but stay in the classroom. And it's amazing to me historically that great teachers basically, to make more money to advance in the profession, had to leave the classroom and leave what they did best and loved most to have a leadership role. And so we're starting to highlight, and we're actually going to do some stuff later this week, many places where there are many more hybrid roles, where master and mentor teachers are teaching half the day or having a day off, where they can go mentor the younger teachers, where they are helping to drive the curriculum, where they're sharing best practices not just in their school but across districts and more across states. And if we can do that, the principal's job becomes much more manageable. If a principal of a large high school, as I say, with 100 teachers, how are they supposed to evaluate every teacher? How many of you as CEOs evaluate 100 of your employees? It's impossible, but that's what we ask principals to do. So if we can have more of a shared leadership, a distributed leadership model, where great teachers are really empowered to make a difference, yes, in their classroom, but beyond that, then one, they stay in the profession, they don't burn out, they have room to move, and the principal's jobs, which are so hugely important, but are also sometimes way too overwhelming, becomes much more manageable. And so lots of places doing some really creative stuff, and we want to continue to highlight that. It's the right thing for teachers, for principals, and obviously we think ultimately for students.
Can you tell us the advantage of the new math under Common Core over classic math?
I think, again, the simple goal for me is to have high standards. And when you have so many children who get to algebra freshman year in high school and fail, and that starts to spiral out of control, when you have so many young people who have no interest or ability to take college-level math and science, and we know where so many of the jobs in the STEM fields, we serve them poorly. So making sure, not just junior and senior year, but in third and fourth and fifth grade and all the way up, that we are really educating students to a high bar is the right thing. Now, this change has been hard. It has not been executed perfectly by any stretch in many places. I think communication to parents in some places has been poor, and how we as a community talk about these things and work together. But I just keep going back. I don't mean to, just keep beating this drum, but we have so many students having to take remedial class in college, and a huge percent are on the math side. Then defending the status quo doesn't make sense. The question is, how do we raise the bar? How do we raise the bar together? How do we make sure that every child has access? I talked about so many students of color don't have access to calculus. Not there. How is that right? How is that fair? So we have to raise the bar. We have to help teachers in this transition. Teachers have to lead this. We have to listen to parents and students themselves, help empower principals. But let's not say, let's go backwards to a time in which standards were so low that children didn't have a chance to continue their education. For me, that's indefensible.
Okay, this is the last question. I don't know how many people here know that Secretary Duncan tried out for the Boston Celtics. But shouldn't you have been named the MVP of the 2014 NBA Celebrity All-Star Game instead of 5'4" comedian Kevin Hart? Really?
Well, Kevin Hart's a friend. He took pity on me and actually gave me the trophy, so the trophy's in my house. So, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your hard work.